That's good. Yes. So we need to sit in the edge. So please just find a seat, and sorry for the darkness. It's just so that you can see the PPT. And we have coffee over here and some snacks if you need it. Yeah. The fuels. Yes. Closer to the people here. Okay, but hello and welcome. We still have a couple of people coming. And this book discussion has been a little bit overdue because we've actually been reading the book by Robert Swallow for months on end now. So we thought that now we simply have to do this book discussion right now before we go on to the next book. But when I was going to find out how do we actually do it, it was a little bit difficult because this book is different. It's a little bit random, but it's because it shoots in so many different directions, you could say. So in desperation, I reached out to the group and I said, like, what kind of themes do you want us to talk about? And there was just silence. So what I have done in the preparation, is that I have taken 10 points from this book that I think is interesting, and then I think that when we take them point by point, and then if you have things that you would like to add or that you thought about reading the book, just please add it, and then when the 10 points are over, then I really feel then we just talk about whatever. Okay. Hopefully in relation to okay, so does it work? Yeah. So the first question is, who was Robert Swallow? And it's actually not a super easy question to answer because we realized that there is not like there is a whole lot of.
That's right. If you can stand there, 因为那个 camera 有的人还在看你，所以你要把背。
So is this good? No. So who was Robert Swallow? It's not a super easy question to say a lot of things about. We actually don't even have a picture of him. We have not been able to find one, and it's not because we haven't tried, because we found this book while we were doing the research for a book project that we were working on ourselves about the Dar es Salaam area. And then so this is actually a super interesting book. For me, it was like, I've never seen somebody write in that detail with this good Chinese about the life in the Hutongs. And I like the sort of the randomness of him, just like, okay, I'm on the street, this is what happens. It's got this really sort of very strong presence in the time where it was written that I think is actually quite seldom. But admittedly, we did find a picture of his father. And I should remember to say that what I say in the following about Robert Swallow is dug up by Emma Harper, who worked for us some months ago and actually still works for us. The only thing is that she's in Singapore, but she's still actually doing a lot of stuff for Beijing postcards. And the father of Robert Swallow, he went to Ningbo as a missionary. So this was probably where Robert Swallow would pick up his excellent Chinese. Emma made a sort of a timeline of Robert Swallow, and I sort of condensed what she found down to a couple of points. So he's born in Ningbo to missionary parents. He lived from 1878 to 1938. He gets his education in the UK. He actually goes back to the UK when he is 20-something, and he also becomes sort of a master of a smaller school there. Then he returns to China in 1904 and works as a professor in Shanxi. Then when we get to 1917, we know that he's in Beijing, but he will soon find his way back to Europe because of the First World War. Then he is coming back to China. He lives a long time in Beijing, and he is a member of the Peking syndicate that is working to get concessions from China. He's also described in some of the material that Emma found as actually going sort of a little bit into business. So even though he is a scholar, then he goes into business. And then he starts to excavate tombs. Like it's quite interesting that the other book we found that he published, like apart from Sidelights on Peking, is about bronze mirrors. It's a whole book, and I don't think that one will be a book that we will read in the Peking Postcards book club. But then he also starts to sell curios, and he retired to Kaifeng, and when he retires, he goes to Kaifeng, and when he finally dies, he's in Shanghai. He never marries. He leaves his sort of inheritance, his everything to his the widow of his brother and his sister. Okay, and this guy you may have heard of, James Bickers, because we had this funny thing that when Emma Harper was sort of really trying, and she used weeks on this, trying to find out on the things on Robert Swallow, then she said, hey, why don't I go onto a heritage site and say, and look for Robert Swallow? And then at first she was super excited because she went onto this heritage site and there was just like this, Robert Swallow entry. And she was like, yeah, I got it. And then like she would just send like mails to this to this guy that was Swallow. And then she got contacted by James Bickers. And then he said, okay, I'm not in a family with Swallow, but I'm also looking for things about him. And James Bickers is not just anybody. If you want to read very interesting things on China, remember this guy. He has made an amazing book about a Shanghai police officer called Empire Made Me, where he's using the letters of this guy that was sort of was 16 years old when he left the UK as part of when sort of the empire was still strong. And he came here almost also as part of the empire. But then all through this story, the empire falls apart. So that's why it's called Empire Made Me. So it's a super interesting book by
Emma,
James Bickers.
Yeah, Emma is saying like his name should be Robert Bickers. Robert Bickers.
Oh, sorry. He's called Robert Bickers. We actually have Emma Harper that made the research that I'm presenting now on the Zoom call. So I have, yeah, that's right. It happened this morning, so I hope that I am excused for the mistake. Yeah. But another link with Robert Bickers is that Robert Bickers has actually made the North China Herald available online. And the North China Herald is the longest English language newspaper in China. It started out on its own, but then it became a weekly edition to another newspaper. But it existed for a very long time. And it is probably in this work that he actually came across Robert Swallow. Because Sidelights on Peking Life was a column in this newspaper. And you actually have much more of it. If you go to the National Library, you can find many different articles, and they're super entertaining about where he's just writing about everything from thieves to whatever, street vendors, and you read the book yourself. So that is where Robert Swallow actually first published these things. And I think when you read through the book, it is also clear that he is almost talking to a newspaper-like audience. He uses a kind of language where he is very much defining himself as a Westerner, but as the Western insider in China, right? So that is probably where this language comes from. And we can see, and when we collected the book, that it was actually reprinted quite a few times. So I think it's fair to say that Robert Swallow would have had a special standing in Beijing society because he was this foreigner, one of very few foreigners that had Chinese that good. And I also think one of the things that I really find very nice about this book is that he puts the Chinese into the book. That's very, very seldom that you will have somebody that goes to that kind of a detail. Boom. Then there is something about living in a courtyard that I thought is very, very interesting, because in the book he writes this: I have lived in a hutung for several years, and it is astonishing what little I know about my neighbors. Each household is in reality a world in itself and cares little about what is going on around it. Now, the reason that I thought that this is interesting, that is that if you go back, if you live in the hutungs today, I would claim that, you know, the foreigners that are living in the hutungs, they care about who lives next to them. That's actually why they are there. You know, it's like a community. You know, it's a whole other thing that is sort of making them want to stay there. But his description of the life in a courtyard is actually that it is a small world in itself. And it is something that you can also find in, for instance, another guy called David Kidd that has written a Peking story that I think could come up in the Beijing Postcards book club. And he's describing very clearly how the family that he was becoming part of, because he married a Chinese woman, that they would have all of these sort of where everybody lived in the courtyard, and in the courtyard where he lived, they had this Chinese garden that was almost like this thing that everything revolved around. Like the family would have its own kind of goldfish that they would have in their courtyard. If you look in this map, you can see that there are some small lakes here. This was where all of the goldfish, they were bred, and families would travel to buy their special kind of goldfish for their courtyard in the center of their courtyard. And another thing I also think is interesting is that even though this is a Peking story, right? He is writing very clearly that most gates in old Beijing, they wouldn't just be red like we see them today. They would actually have characters on them that would tell you where do the people of this family come from, because all of pretty much the Beijing population was in one way or the other migrants. So I think this is really interesting that you would bring your own identity into, like local identity, into Beijing like that and showcase it on your gate. I kind of knew that, but I think that Robert Swallow, he's really sort of picking things out and confirming and sort of connecting some dots for me that I have not seen a writer do before that. Boom. And then there are the people of the streets. And when I prepared, I have to be honest, that I looked like crazy for a quotation that I think is in there. But you have to correct me if it's wrong, because I think he has this description of him talking to a street vendor, where the street vendor is just really sort of surprised about him talking to him and him almost becoming human in the process. Before that, he's only been the guy standing on the street selling whatever thing, but I couldn't find that description. But I think it is super interesting, because today, if you look at the Kuai, I have the same feeling. Like when we are talking about the street vendors that he describes, I feel that in so many ways, the Kuai is this layer of Beijing society today that connects the city. The city can't live without it. They come to your door. You don't have to go out, just like Robert Swallow is describing, that you can't do that. Like you don't have to leave your courtyard to sustain a living as a family. This guy, Colin Chinnery, is a guy that I hope that we will work with in the future. Because Colin Chinnery, he set out more than 10 years ago to try to preserve the sounds of Beijing. Because he realized that, you know, these sounds of the hutongs were very special. And I don't know if you have tried to live in the hutong, but you actually still have the street vendors coming in and selling things. And when I lived in the hutongs, more than once, I was just trying to listen. What are they actually saying? And I actually chased them a little bit, Colin Chinnery like, and sort of taped it and in order for my teacher to hear it. And even him, he was like, okay, yeah, I don't really get it. But just like Robert Swallow is actually describing in his book. And Colin Chinnery has actually really gone to an extreme. So here you can see him standing, trying to record the whistle of the pigeons. I don't know if you've been in the Hutong, because you have this very special sound that is actually very special for Beijing, that you would put this whistle on the leader of the pigeons, I guess, on his leg or something like that. And here he's trying to capture exactly that sound. And I know that at the Hutong Museum, they have a whole little room where they just have all of the sounds of the Hutong. But we hope also to work with him in the future. Boom. Boom. Yeah. Flower streets and willow lanes. That is a chapter in this book. And for me, as a researcher looking into this area, then that is maybe the chapter in the book where I think he provides the most sort of historical background. And I can see that also to other researchers that has looked into sort of the Brussels of this city, that he's actually a very, very important person when it comes to the sort of the specifics of how were these sort of brothels run. And when we're talking about this area that he calls the licensed area, then we're talking about this area. You can see here you have the Chenmen gate, and it is this actually quite big area called the Bada Hutong, or the 8 great hutongs, that is defined as the licensed area. And like he's describing, then inside this area, you would have hundreds of brothels. They were at first legalized in 1905. He's describing it like 1912, because that was where Yuan Shikai would take over. And as he's also describing, it would have a very strong link to the political world, because the moment the parliament came out, you needed places to have meetings, and that would be the Brussels. And like he's describing, and he's I like that he's very careful about not glorifying prostitution. But on the other hand, he's also saying that we cannot make a one-to-one comparison with what an area like that would look like in Europe. And he's saying that many people will actually just come for a cup of tea or to look at the girls or play with the girls. There's not necessarily something sexual going on. But another thing that I think was very, very interesting, and I think this is the book where I have seen it described in the most detail, is the thing where you have a new customer arrive to a brothel. And maybe I should remember to say that the brothels were divided into 4 different grades. And the top grades were places that were really sensitive about what kind of customer came in their doors. Because if you had one that didn't really have the status or the money to qualify, then it would affect business. So the moment a new person came in the door, he would sit down for just around half an hour, be allowed to see the girls, then he would leave again. And then he would probably not come back till within a month or so. And in the meanwhile, you would have been going and you would have looked into who is this guy? How much money does he have? And the moment he had sort of been allowed in and to be part of the brothel, then it feels as if, and that's where I really think that Robert Swallow is adding something, like he had earned himself a club membership. Because it's very interesting that the way he sort of says that 3 times a year, you would call out for the customers to come, not because they should have a free treat, because they should actually pay sort of for this club membership for when, the paper was put in the windows, when the prostitutes had to buy furs to stay warm, when you put a shade in the courtyard for the sun, that kind of thing. And this relation, that specific, actually surprised me a little bit, that it could be done like that.
Might he have spent some time there?
Yeah, I know. That is a possibility. It's called field work.
But last one question, because I think the book also said that the brothels were taxed before Qianlong or something.
Yes.
So they were legalized before.
So I think it's a mess, right? So that's I think when it comes to the brothels, then we are into sort of a gigantic gray zone, and I refuse to believe that you can have a thriving business anywhere in this city where the government will not want its part. Yeah. So I think that you will have had times where it was semi-legalized, but at least during the Qing dynasty and big parts of the Qing dynasty, then you were doing a lot to segregate and sort of suppress brothels in a way so that you could sort of control who were going, and you hope that the Manchus would not be going too much, and not the Manchu ladies, at least, so who because you felt that would be taken away from their status. But when Robert Swallow is writing this book, then we know that all of this is sort of falling apart. Sitting at the National Library, we found a lot of articles about like that you started to have new brothel goers, and some of them, they came from the acting community. Now the actors, they were below the prostitutes, because the prostitutes could actually marry and get into a better family like that. They still had the opportunity to get sort of be elevated in society. But the actors, the moment you had taken money to act, you would, for the next 3 generations, or your family would only be able to stay within that sort of circle. You could only get acting jobs. And this happened to people in late Qing dynasty because family members started to take the money. Because what happens in the late Qing dynasty, actually, and into the Republican period, is that suddenly these outcasts, they become superstars in Beijing, because you have the movies, you have the Western style theaters. Suddenly this becomes scalable. You can use the actors on commercials, and in this way you have the actors are suddenly elevated in status, and we can see from the newspapers that people going to Brussels, they would start to complain. Hey, these the lowest of the lowest scum are coming into our brothel. They are not welcome here. They used to Qing-an, or like kind of kowtow, like bow to the prostitutes. And this is writing that you will have directly in the Chinese newspapers, because things are not what they were at the end of the Qing dynasty and the beginning of the Republic. Then you have the politicians in the Zhongshan Park, and I have been looking very much forward to this part of it. And it is not least because I've just written an article about exactly this. But it says here in the book, if you take a walk in the Central Park on a summer's afternoon, you will come across many middle-aged men with imitation Panama hats on their gloved hands. No, sorry, that's not being. I think it was a little early this morning when I did the presentation. Sorry about that. And occasionally glance down at their patent leather shoes. These are usually members of parliament, the so-called guests of the government. Some of their colleagues, however, prefer bowler hats and sports straggling goatee beards. Now, this is interesting because when this book was published, we are in 1927. And in this time, you have just had the first ever park open in all of Beijing. And it opened right here. And this was a whole new thing, like just next to the Forbidden City. And so now suddenly you had a point where all people, they could gather. And it was a very interesting place because in this new modern place, you sort of looked for the new sort of modern identity of Beijing. You tried to find a way that could make sort of Beijing a modern city in a Chinese way. And if you go there today, you can still find a lot of the monuments that were put up, because as you may know, then having monuments on street level, admittedly, you did have the Pilo, but you did not have a whole lot in Beijing that's like statues and so on. But the Zhongshan Park would be the first place where you sort of played around these new symbols of trying to make a modern Beijing. And when we look at the Zhongshan Park, then we can find this new Western-inspired symbolism in a search of modern Chinese, a modern Chinese identity. And this pavilion, I think, is especially interesting because this pavilion was set up actually by the guy who made the whole park. It's called Zhu Qichen. He's the first city planner in modern Beijing, or like Republican Beijing. And his idea was that just like you had the Pilo, like these very classical Chinese archways at Dongdan and Dongsi and Xisi and Xidan, then he wanted these pavilions all over the city. And his idea was that on the pillars, you would have quotations from all of the great Chinese thinkers. They were sort of carrying the roof of this structure that admittedly is very Western to look at, right? So it is like this kind of bridging, like Western and Chinese thinking in sort of trying to find a road into some kind of modernity. The interesting thing here is that all of this discussion that is also described in the book took place from 1913 and pretty much till 1949, when the communists are coming in. And the moment they're in, pretty much, then they are putting a lid on a lot of this discussion. A lot of the meetings that will actually show a whole other direction for Beijing is actually held inside of the Zhongshan Park because you didn't have a Great Hall of the People and all of that at that point, and it was in there that discussion would happen. And it's a quite interesting thing because all of these Republicans that had been used to argue their hearts out and intellectuals and so on, you will still have a good group of them that had actually stayed in Beijing and fought for a new Beijing. And among them was Lin Huiying. You have maybe heard about her. She was the wife of Yang Zicheng, and they were this power couple in Beijing that really had an attitude like Yang Zicheng. He said about Mao Zedong that Mao Zedong, he could care about politics, than he would care about architecture. Now that is pretty bold. And Lin Huiying on one of these meetings in 1951, I believe, then she was saying that if these gates here, you can see that Yang Zecheng and Lin Huiying, they felt were integral to the whole city plan of Beijing. If they were torn down, then she would hang herself from one of them. But this voice of the Republicans was silenced pretty much just hours after this meeting was over, because you literally at that same meeting took the decision to take down these gates, and you pretty much had workers standing like this, so when the meeting was over, they were taken down immediately. So Robert Swallow's sort of Beijing is ceasing to exist almost in an instant. That is an exaggeration, but very, very quickly after 1949. Another thing that you can also find inside of the Zhongshan Park is this. It has been a little bit, I think it's a little bit out of shape here, but this is a very interesting piece of architecture, because it is the archway that was raised for Clemens von Kettler, the German ambassador that was killed. He was killed in the year 1900 when he went to protest because of the Boxers that were wanting to kill all of the foreigners in Beijing. And after the Boxer Rebellion was over, then this was raised where he died, and right here you had an apology from the emperor himself. Now that changed, because after the First World War, when Germany lost and China was actually the enemy in the end of Germany, then you would move the archway into the Zhongshan Park. You would take down the apology, and then you would call it the preserve sort of history. Preserve peace gate. And going to the Zhongshan Park today, I think it's still extremely interesting to look at these sort of symbols of the past, and they were very, very much part of the Beijing that Robert Swallow he knew. Okay, pawn shops and money lenders. This is something that I thought was quite interesting, because I have paid attention to the insane amount of pawn shops that you have, pawn brokers that you have here in Beijing, like today. And I've always thought, what are they actually doing? And not a lot of my Chinese friends, they only know that when they sell watches, then you want to buy them because they are definitely genuine. Because if you buy it from a pawnbroker, it has gone through that whole thing. But during Robert Swallow's time, I think it's interesting that it was such an integral part of Beijing life. Because in my country, I don't know if what it's like for you, but in Denmark, if you pawn something, it's like people will look at you like you are very close to bankruptcy, and look at it as it is simply just horrible, that your life is like really, really going downwards. But I think it's an interesting point that the pawn shop in Beijing, it was actually also just a way of storing things, because the moving in and outs of Beijing were many. You would often have officials that would come here and only stay for a couple of years. Then what should they do with their furniture and so on? So that holding function was in many ways often actually the most important function of the pawn brokers. And I think, and to me, I thought that was actually super interesting in itself. Then there are the house prices. That might sound a little bit random to you, but there is a point because of this. Because he's writing, and I hope now that I have been too sleepy when I wrote it, that owing to the great increase in the value of property and the consequent rise of rents in the East City and the districts surrounding the legation border, many of the inhabitants of those parts have migrated to the North and West City, where things are somewhat cheaper. This is interesting because of two things. One thing is that before 1912, all of the money was up here. This was the best place that you could live. This was where you had the mansions that were sustained by the government. But when we get to the latter part of the Qing dynasty and the other part of the 1912, sort of it moves down here. Also spurred by the fact that you have many more foreigners here. This is where the modernity reaches Beijing. You can see that just walking down this street, that you have many sort of Western style pieces of architecture in the streets. So you have this market change within years from the north to the south. Suddenly the manchus that used to be the ones with the money there and almost have the status in society, they're impoverished. They don't have any skills to speak of because they have been this army of the government that in the end of the Qing actually is not much of an army anymore. But the other thing that I think is really quite interesting here is that now this book is published in 1927 for the first time. And he's writing that the rents, they are just going up because people want to live in and around the legation quarter and so on. But Robert Swallow, when he wrote this book, could not know that only a year later, the capital was moved down to Nanjing. So actually the whole system, all of the money going through the brothels, all of the ticket money going to the actors and the theaters and so on, they became much, much less because suddenly you would move the government now down to Nanjing, and that all that money would now not trickle through Beijing anymore. So when we sit at the National Library, we can see that in the 1930s, rents would go really low and landlords would reach out to the people that rented from them and say, you can get it 30% cheaper. And when a landlord does that, then that's because the economy is really, 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 really bad. So I think that that's actually an interesting point that sort of encapsulates the book, because in many ways, what Robert Swallow is talking about here is the period between 1912 and 1928. I think I said that Robert Swallow's Beijing, it sort of stopped in 1949. I would like to retract that. I think it's a better way of stating it, that his Beijing is in many ways the one between 1912 and 1928. Okay, then we have the actors. I think they should also be mentioned because right now you are sitting inside of the Darsalam area. And so much of what is in this book is about this area, like the brothels, the actors, a lot of the shops and so on. All of that is actually taking place right where you are now. And in the same area that I pointed out to you before, the Bada Hutung, you also have a lane that's called the Baishun Hutung. And in the book, you have many pictures of like that area. You all have pictures from inside courtyards where actors, they were trained and so on. And when we are talking about the acting world, then I think that is maybe the other chapter that I really think is going into depth with a lot of detail that I think is very valuable. The way he describes that you can go, that you have this it's a god that you will pray to, that you cannot go behind and look at the actors when they have applied their the face makeup, and the power of the guilds is also extremely interesting in his describing, right? That you really have these trade guilds that are really keeping things together. in Beijing, even though, however, they are crumbling by the day because Beijing has, after 1912, been thrown into this capitalism. But some of the actors would benefit from this capitalism that was going on. And one of the actors that would throw away the shackles of the acting guild was this guy. Oh, sorry, this guy, Mei Lanfang. Because Mei Lanfang, he was going to be the absolute superstar of China. Even today, I think people would argue that Mei Lanfang is probably the most known actor in China ever. His movements would, even into the communist period, be seen as something that the government should decide, because he was actually pretty much becoming almost like an ambassador to China. He would visit in the 30s, like the US, and in many ways, sort of the status that Beijing opera would get worldwide, it would get through him. And the interesting thing about Mei Lanfang is that he was born into a family that had been these outcasts for like more than 100 years. And in his family, they would take on the Dan roles. That means the roles of women. And as it is described in the book, then during the Qing dynasty, you couldn't, as a woman, act on stage. This was not something that changed till after 1912. But when we get to the other side of 1912, then you start to talk about that the women, they had the body problem. They would be very popular in this area, especially in the Dar es Salaam street, but people would go only to look at them. They were not there for the art. So in this environment, you would start to take sort of the aesthetics of Beijing opera and sort of like emphasize them more. And this is one of the reasons that Beijing opera is the way it is today. And another thing you would also do when Mei Lanfang started to shoot to fame because of theaters and cinemas and so on, was that he would go to the US, like I said. And when he went to the US, you had to define Beijing opera. So a guy called Chiu Shan, he would write some very thick books about what is Beijing opera, because you wanted to sort of almost make a Beijing opera tradition that competed a little bit with the Western opera tradition. And in this sort of process, you could say that Chiu Shan was almost creating something that maybe didn't exist before, because Beijing opera was not called Beijing opera in Beijing. It was actually all kinds of local traditions that had come in via the guild halls. So Beijing opera is not Beijing opera. All of it came from the outside. And you would then start to merge it in to Beijing opera. And the reason that you had the best actors here was that they originally catered to the palace, so that they would have earned money from the palace. So in this way, you sort of had the infrastructure in place. But in the beginning, like it's also described in Robert Swallow's book, and that was actually the quotation that I thought is kind of interesting here. Like, it is true that we may admire some of the gorgeous costumes and admit that the wonderful makeup and graceful deportment of some artists as Mei Lanfang and Chen Yunqiu entitle them to take high rank amongst the actors of the world. Yet on the whole, the ordinary performance appears to us to be long drawn out and wearisome. And I think here we can really see that he's talking to a Western audience. I think he's really defining himself as a Westerner here. And he goes on also to describe how, you don't originally had theaters. It would be going on in tea houses. And one of the reasons that for the makeup and so on is because it would be taking place by the day. And you had to compete with the scrambling of cops and and so on, and the social interaction of the people around the different tables were actually part of it. So the thing that when you have the breakthrough with the Western theaters is completely changing the scene. Like Chiru Shen is taking the opera tradition from the tea houses and putting it on a Western-like stage, and now people have to be silent because art is going on the stage. It's very, very, very different like that. So that is one of the parts where I think that it's also he's got a very, very interesting sort of take on that. Then the last thing I think are the ghost stories, because I have to admit that when we found this book, what sort of finally made us say, okay, we will go for this book, was maybe the last chapter. And I think it's interesting that the other chapters, they only have the titles. The ghost story is actually lining out what kind of different ghosts are on what page, because for me the ghost stories are like really, really quite kind of interesting, because it shows like what kind of a place the Hutongs were, and all of the superstition that was going on, obviously in the Hutongs, and he's talking about the haunted houses and all of this. And another thing that for me was interesting is that when I think, I don't know if you had heard about the wall building ghost before, but I had never. The only like sort of spirit I had actually really heard about was the one that is featured in this book by Paul French, Midnight in Peking. And here I am talking about the Huli Jin, or the fox spirit that haunts around this tower. And the reason that I'm saying this is that I think it's quite interesting that in Paul French's book, he's very much using the Huli Jin, like this fox spirit, as this horrible woman spirit that will lure men into trouble and kill them and that kind of thing. And that is, I think, a very Western take on the ghosts, right? It's like a very taken out of a horror movie, pretty much. And admittedly, Robert Swallow is also talking a lot about haunted houses where people don't want to live. But he's also talking about a lot of the ghosts, they're actually quite friendly. There's not really a problem with them. And actually the fox spirit is one of them. It's like actually normally it's not that bad. It's actually okay. And some of the ghosts, I think are just hilarious. Like, I don't know if you read, if you stumbled upon the one that has no face, it has no feet, and it has no hands. It's just there, and it's not really dangerous. It's just there. But my favorite is probably the wall building ghost, because that one is just like, you cannot make that up. Actually, you can't probably. But that is just like highly entertaining. Okay, so these were my 10 points. It's like you can see, it was a little bit difficult for me to find out how am I going to do this, because you have so many different directions. So I think in the following, let's just discuss the book. The next book we will take on is actually getting even more nerdy, because I think that the Robert Swallow book has sort of given us a direction for the Beijing Postcards book club. So wait for it, because I think that we will let other book clubs read Wild Swans and all that kind of thing. They're free to do that, but we won't do that, because I think that it's interesting to find scripts that are maybe not things that people will normally think about reading. So the next book that we have found is next book. Oh, anticipation! It's this one, and it is a Peking, a social survey by Sidney Gamble. And the reason that this book is so amazing, and as you can see, It's actually lethal. But the reason that this book is amazing is that Sidney Gamble, in 1919, even before Robert Swallow, then he would organize like hundreds of volunteers to run around Beijing with questionnaires. And he would be working together with the police in Beijing, having in his hand their statistics, and he would gather all kinds of numbers on Beijing, and his goal, and he would do this like many times over. Coming back to Beijing, his goal was to, for the first time, produce reliable numbers on Beijing. And the book reads very much like Robert Swallow, so I don't know what I'm going to do next time when we have the book discussion, but because he has got the same quality that he's a good writer. But he will write about everything. He will cover many of the same things here, but it will. So the thing that this book will give is like accurate ideas about how many people actually lived in Beijing, again about the prostitutes, the industrialization. What was the guilt like? He has this amazing description. He has a couple of pages about the guild of the blind. That is the oldest guild in the whole city, and he's attending a meeting where suddenly hundreds of blind people, they're just coming from everywhere, and it's taking a place in this temple. So he also has a keen eye, like Robert Swallow, for like these really sort of almost surreal details. So I might the next book after this one, I might get us a little bit back again on track. But I couldn't help it because I think this book is very interesting, and I know that you can find it digitally on the web. But we also made a print of it if you're interested, so you can also get it from
did he write
us.
This?
He wrote. It was published in 1921. So it's like so it's before. So I think it's just interesting because I would claim. And we have been looking into the Ming Dynasty and Qing Dynasty files. I would claim that this book is the first book that gives you reliable numbers on Beijing. And the reliability is not only the numbers in themselves, it's also because he will point out the weaknesses. He will point out where he's not good. And so if you are looking into sort of modern Beijing, then you will notice that everybody, they have to get across Gamble. A lot of people won't agree with him, but they will have to look at his numbers and relate to them, because in so many ways it's what exists. Like this book is almost a Bible when it comes to that period of time.
Did they know each other?
I think it's very difficult to think that they didn't, but I don't know. But I think that I think I would not be surprised if Robert Swallow were among the people working on this project for Gamble, because it's obviously the same, some of the same times. Not with the first one, that Robert Swallow has left just in 1917, with Gamble is coming, but he's actually coming back and making other books on Beijing, and he will. If you go on to Google and just write Sidney Gamble and Beijing, then you will also find his collection photos of Beijing. He took like so many photos of Beijing that was discovered by a relative in the 1980s. And you will notice, if you've looked in books with old photos of Beijing, that a lot of them, they come from him. Like because you found this box with thousands and thousands and thousands of pictures. So, and today he's actually predominantly, I guess, in the wider public, known for this treasure of photos.
Talking about photos, I brought my book of historical photos because it was published about the same time as this one. So if people wanted to
Yes, of course.
It's not by
course.
Gamble, it's by some German photographer.
Yes. Okay, so now I will sit down, and if you have anything, the thing is that by talking so much that I'm so afraid of is that it makes other people silent. So I really hope that you will say anything. And if we also have coffee.